the summary advice that I would give myself is you're okay. Like you're okay, even if things aren't okay right now. That if you can put yourself in the way of beauty, if you can trust that deep inner voice within you, if you can find a way to keep moving forward, even when it hurts, putting one foot in front of the other, even when you make mistakes, if you can keep that kind of sense of curiosity and faith that, onward, forward is the direction of real life, which is another sugar quote, you're going to be okay.
Hello, Cheryl. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Christy. It's wonderful to be here.
We are so excited to have you for everyone listening and watching. I am here with Cheryl Strayed. She is a New York Times bestselling author. She's the podcast host of the Dear Sugars podcast. And many of you probably know her from her novel Wild, which was adapted into a film starring one of my favorites, Reese Witherspoon. And that's among a couple of incredible things she's done. Tell us what I missed, Cheryl. Give us a little intro and give everyone a background.
Okay. So, yeah, I'm actually the author of 4 books. Torch, which is a novel, Wild, a memoir, Tiny Beautiful Things, a collection of my Dear Sugar columns, which was recently adapted into a Hulu TV show starring Catherine Hahn, and a collection of my quotes, Brave Enough. And of course, I also do all kinds of other writing. I write, just lots of short pieces that are published here and there. And I still do a monthly Dear Sugar column on my Substack newsletter.
I love all of your work. I'm such a huge fan, and honestly a little bit intimidated to ask like the queen of all advice what her best piece of advice is. But I think we should just get right into it because I think people are probably just dying to know. So what is the best piece of advice that you've ever gotten?
That I've received, yes. I have to say it's powerful advice that I got from my mother, who those of you who've read my work know that my mom died at 45 of cancer. And she was a wonderful woman. And her death really was so formative to me. And something she told me when I was a teenager that I didn't really understand, it was advice when I received it, but it did later turn out to be some of the best advice I think I've ever gotten. And it was this, quite simply, put yourself in the way of beauty. And what she meant is, it's up to us to find the beautiful things on the hardest days, in the hardest times of our lives. She would say it to me when I was like a surly teenager and complaining about things and I had a lot to complain about as a teenager, I have to say. I didn't have indoor plumbing when I was a teenager. We had an outhouse. I lived in northern Minnesota. We didn't have a telephone. We didn't have electricity for part of the time that I was a teenager. So I was always like, I want a phone. I want a shower. I want a toilet.
Yeah, basic needs.
But just whenever I was being cranky, she'd say, Cheryl, life is always going to offer you challenges. There are always going to be things that make you unhappy or that you find hard. And it's up to you in the hardest times to put yourself in the way of beauty. There's always a sunrise and always a sunset. And like I said, it was like this time release advice where you're like, whatever, rolling your eyes. That's what I did. And then later I realized, oh, that's good advice.
Was there a specific moment or moments as you've gotten older where you've referenced that advice in particular, do you think?
Yeah. So where it really hit me, like a big, it was like a kind of tsunami wave of realization, is when I was, of course, a few years after her death, hiking the Pacific Crest Trail, the journey I wrote about in my book, Wild. I realized, I had gone on that hike in so many ways because I was suffering so terribly and suffering really because of her death. I was grieving her. And, I was in this situation. I put myself in this situation where I literally was there for every sunrise and sunset. And trust me when I say that those sunrises and sunsets on the Pacific Crest Trail are some of the most beautiful things I've ever witnessed. And I realized, wow, my mother, yeah, this was a way of teaching me how to save myself. This was her way of teaching me a lesson about how to essentially be the agent of your own life and to find what you need, find that sunset or that sunrise if it's going to lift your spirit, find that sense of connection. And, obviously other people can help us along the way, but ultimately we can only save ourselves. And I think that that's really what put yourself in the way of beauty means, that is that you get to be in charge of your life, even though you don't get to be in charge of a lot of stuff. You don't get to say, this person doesn't get this disease, or this person doesn't die, or this person doesn't break up with me, or this person doesn't, fill in the blank. But what you are in charge of is what you do, the ways that you find the light in the darkest times.
I love that. I think it's an interesting perspective when you talk about because a lot of people would say maybe that is comparable to being find positivity in things, like find a silver lining. But there is this trend now of saying there's such thing as toxic positivity. Like there's such thing as sometimes things are so bad that there's nothing good you can find and you just sit in that badness. Do you think though that, do you think that would venture into toxic positivity, or do you think there's a way you can still embrace the hard things that happen to you and still find the beauty?
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you asked that because, I've thought of this about toxic positivity all my life. It's not just a new thing. Like I do, and this is the fascinating thing for me in the work I've done as Dear Sugar, because first of all, so, I write this advice column, Dear Sugar, and I started writing it in 2010. By 2012, it was a book, Tiny Beautiful Things. And there I was in a bookstore. And, I really think of my Dear Sugar columns as really, personal essays. Obviously, I give advice, but they're deep essays about what it means to be human. They're very literary. I tell stories, they're not the
They're
traditional
beautiful.
advice
If anyone
columns.
hasn't heard them or seen them in a book, go buy the book. They're beautiful.
Oh, thank you. And so, and there's a 10th anniversary edition out now. So it's even new.
Oh,
There's new columns in it too.
even
Do you know that?
better.
Yeah.
I
But
did
what
not
was
know that.
funny, oh, you didn't? Okay. No, you got to
No.
get yourself a new copy, man.
Okay,
It's like,
gotta go do that on my list.
But what was so surprising to me is that um, there it was in the self-help section of bookstores. And I was like, wait a minute. I don't write self-help. I don't read self-help. I'm not a self-help person. And which is ridiculous because of course, I I am helping people. There's
Yeah.
writing to me and saying, this is your problem. And I'm like, here's what I think that might be helpful. But, and I realized that the reason I was resistant to that is exactly what you just pointed to, is this kind of trite, kind of very, very often kind of ridiculously, um, sort of, sort of look out on the bright side way of thinking about problems. Like, oh, come on, you're just being a pain in the butt. But see, let's just cheer up, right? That kind of thing. But of course, anyone who's read any of the Dear Sugar columns or any of my work knows that, I'm not talking at all about doing anything like that. Like, if anything, I say, go, into the opposite, to go into the sorrow, go into the pain, go into the darkness. But the gritty truth of it is when you're living through a difficult time or having an experience that feels the most searingly painful, of your life, or you're genuinely suffering, when you are in that place of truth and pain and suffering, you do get to make a decision. Do I stay here and languish and possibly even wither up and die? Or do I try to find, there's one of my favorite writers, Edna O'Brien. So there's this phrase from one of her books where I'm going to just paraphrase, but she says, when you go into the deepest darkness, it's up to you to find some glimmer in it. And I think of that. I think that's very much what my mom was saying in terms of put yourself in the way of beauty. My mother is somebody who had, very difficult things happen to her. And she always managed to find love and optimism. And so to me, it's not, let's gloss it over and get onward with like a sense of like, denying what's painful or hard. But let's say this is painful and hard. And guess what? There's also beauty in it. And almost I can't think of a struggle. I wonder if I can ask you a question too, Christy. I can't think of a bad thing that's happened to me that I haven't ultimately also been able to say and see that really bad thing also gave me something that was ultimately important or beautiful or powerful. Even if I could go back in time and say, okay, no, I'll give that beautiful, important, powerful thing back because I would like that thing to not have not happened. But what I mean to say is those things do happen to us. And it's, we get to choose. Are we going to say this is just all ruin and awfulness and I will refuse to see anything good in it? Or do you say, okay, I am going to find the beautiful thing in this ugly thing? And that's a very gritty, hardcore kind of advice. That's not at all about being positive. It's about telling the truth.
Yeah, I love that. I that was the most beautiful explanation. It's honestly been a phrase that I feel like has popped up a lot as I've shared quotes and I think just nowadays. And I agree that I think toxic positivity is more the denial aspect of it.
Yeah.
And I think that what you're talking about is, like you said, truth. It's leaning into the reality of your life. But what I always think when people comment like, oh, that's toxic positivity, is I'm always like, what other option do we really have? Are we just going to just be miserable and just think that our trials and the bad things that happen to us in life are just because terrible things happen and there's nothing good from them and there's nothing good we can learn from them? Like, this is almost our only way to preserve our own mental health and our own well-being is to find that goodness. And like your mom said, to find that beauty.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, I also think sometimes when people respond with that kind of rage to like an optimism, it's like that's the moment they're in. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like very often you could put up a quote like that on on Instagram or something, and people will respond to it from the place they're in.
Yeah.
And I recently had a friend who just had something really hard happen to him. And he was like, I've never been one of those silver lining people, where I was like, well, even in the hardest things, there's a silver lining. And he was like, I just think that's a bunch of BS or whatever. And then he's like, but I have to admit, that in the midst of this difficult time, what I've seen is, I'm more aware of like all of the beautiful things in my life. I'm more aware of the ways I'm grateful for my friends and family. I'm more aware of what's really important. And he's like, I hate the silver lining thing. And yet it's true. you know? And so it's
true.
sometimes it's like, you just have to say, okay, maybe this isn't the most useful quote for you right now, but ultimately we can't deny that, just like we've been saying, that we, you do have to sometimes say, I will acknowledge that good things happen from the bad things sometimes, that there are things that I can only see after having suffered or lost or struggled.
Absolutely. That reminds me of a quote that I love. I think it's Good Will Hunting and Robin Williams says in it, and it's, you'll have bad times, but they'll always wake you up to the good stuff you weren't paying attention to. And I remember that quote a lot.
Right.
I love
That's
that one.
true. And when somebody hears that in a moment where they're just like really struggling, they might just feel like, oh yeah, well, screw you, buddy.
Yeah.
And that feels harmful to them. But like that's the whole deal with life, right? You read a quote and sometimes it rings your bell and sometimes it doesn't, and it means something different to different people at different times.
Absolutely.
Even me, like when you said to me, what's the best advice you've received? Well, I received that advice and I rolled my eyes.
Yeah.
And I did think my mom was like, oh, Mom, you're such an optimist, And I take comfort in that now, Christy, because I have 2 teenagers and I try to dole out all of these lovely life lessons
And
I was
little
like,
do they know who they're getting their life lessons from.
I know. Well, a lot of times I want to say to them, listen, kids, you may roll your eyes at everything I say, but a lot of people like actually want my advice. But
Like,
I
would kill
just
to have it.
I just hope that
Yeah.
some of it is being absorbed. And knowing that what I did with my own mother's advice, like I just trust that some of the things I'm saying to them will come through.
Absolutely. I would love to also ask you, this is probably going to be a hard question, but maybe really off the top of your head. Do you have a favorite piece of advice that you've ever given? Maybe it was on your Dear Sugar column. Maybe it was through a life situation.
Well, obviously, as Dear Sugar, I have given so many pieces of advice, but I do think that a few of them are core. So maybe I could share with you a couple of them.
Absolutely.
One of them is you cannot convince people to love you. That is an absolute rule. And that's a line I wrote in the title column of the book, Tiny Beautiful Things. And this one, I think, if we really can actually believe that and hold that in our hearts, I think it would make love so much easier. Because I do think that sometimes people find themselves in relationships where they feel like there's this scarcity, like they're trying to kind of beg somebody to love them more or want to spend more time to them or be more into them or whatever it is. And I just want to say, like, give up, because you're worth, what you're worthy of is somebody being, um, just loving you freely, loving you abundantly. And it isn't possible really to persuade people to love us. I'm not saying that we never, should have problems in our relationships or times where you need to say, you hurt my feelings, or this made me feel this way or that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about that core level. If you feel like, that you're always basically begging somebody or trying to persuade somebody to give you love, whether that be in friendship or romantic love, or even frankly, I wrote that line from a place, actually, I was thinking about my father when I wrote that line. My father, who left my life basically when I was 6, and I spent my childhood thinking, like, why doesn't my father love me? And I realized, yeah, it's not my fault. Nothing I do will convince him to love me. And so I think that lesson, that piece of advice is really kind of at core to, when a lot of people who write to me with love problems, that's the problem is, that they just don't, you can't make somebody love you. You just have to go out there and find the people who truly do.
I love that.
Another piece of advice, that's connected, I think, to that is to trust, you can't fake the core. The truth that you feel at your center is the truth that you should trust and follow. That, those inner voices that say, oh, I know I should want this, or I should do this, or I should be in this relationship, or I should stay, or I should major in blah, blah, blah instead of blah, blah, blah. Those things, if you go against that inner current, that core truth within you, it will always lead to unhappiness. I know that for sure.
I love that. I love both of those things. I think if people had both of those pieces of advice plastered on their walls, there would be far less problems in life. I couldn't love those more.
Thank you.
I'm wondering too, as a quote person, if you have a favorite quote or an affirmation or mantra, something that you repeat to yourself a lot.
I wrote about this quote in my introduction to Brave Enough, my book of quotes. I wrote this quote that my grandmother, my mother's mother, said to me as a kid, and it's just like I never forgot it. It stayed with me, and later I was like, the reason it stayed with me is I think it's pretty wise. It's love many, trust few, and always paddle your own canoe. And I feel like it really encapsulates so much of like, yeah, if you can do that, you're going to have a pretty good life. And I think that the always paddle your own canoe part was especially important to me, because it is about, it's interesting. I never even thought of it until I'm saying this out loud to you right now. It is in some weird way connected to the quote my mother gave me.
Yeah.
Because it's about being, the captain of your life. It's about taking personal responsibility for your own well-being and your own happiness. It's about saying, like, of course I need others. Of course I need people to love me and be there for me and, all of that stuff. But ultimately, I need to paddle my own canoe. I need to walk my own path. I need to trust that inner voice within me. I need to have that sense of resilience and independence and an awareness that I have the capacity to direct and change and transform my life.
Yeah. Well, and like your mom said, the only person at the end of the day who can find beauty in trials in life is going to be yourself. No one can
Yeah,
find that for you. No one can convince you of it. It's at the end of the day really all up to you. And so I think those really
absolutely.
are interchangeable.
Hmm.
Um I also, this is a question that I like to ask, and I am rephrasing it a little just because you have such a fascinating story. You've just had quite an abundant life, at least from where I'm sitting, where most of us are sitting. Um, and you were talked about how you lost your mom in your 20s, which I can't even imagine the pain and all that that brings. And then you dealt with addiction, and you dealt with divorce, and then you went on this hike on your own along the Pacific Crest Trail. And I'm just wondering now, 30 some years later, if you were looking at that 20-year-old girl who was in so much pain and struggling so much, what would you tell her? What advice would you give her that you think could help her?
Oh my gosh, there again, it's just so much. But what's cool, I mean, so I love that whenever I'm asked that question, I can go, okay, read Tiny Beautiful Things. The title column of the book is literally a letter that's like, what advice would you give your 22-year-old self? And I wrote that advice. I mean, I wrote that advice in my 40s, but now here I am at 54. And, the big takeaway, like the summary advice that I would give myself is, you're okay. Like, you're okay even if things aren't okay right now. That if you can put yourself in the way of beauty, if you can trust that deep inner voice within you, if you can find a way to keep moving forward, even when it hurts, putting one foot in front of the other, even when you make mistakes, if you can keep that kind of sense of curiosity and faith that, onward, forward is the direction of real life, which is another sugar quote, you're going to be okay. And what I'm struck by, I pay attention to this question when I've heard so many people ask this question. And so often, like pretty much every like older person says, okay, the advice I'd give my younger self is it's going to be okay. You're going to be
Mhm.
okay. You are okay. Right. You hear that over and over again. And so what that tells us is so many of us, especially in our younger years, maybe even in middle age and older, but especially in our younger years, we have that, like when we look back on ourselves, we have that memory of how uncertain and anxious and afraid we felt, how we felt like we weren't enough, pretty enough, skinny enough, smart enough, successful enough, rich enough, whatever, all the enoughs. And I think what life and age teaches you is, that what you're moving toward is not more of everything. So then you're finally like, now I finally do have enough, but actually less. That you move in the direction of letting go of a sense, that false sense that you need to do something that is enough. All you have to do is learn how to love, live with love and generosity, pay your own electricity bill, and find a way to feel like at one, that the unifying, I feel like the unifying voice where you live a life that reflects the inner voice that is within you is the greatest form of happiness. And I think that age teaches us that we need to quiet that voice that says, you're not enough, you're not enough, you're not enough, and embrace the voice that says, we're not here to get more. We're here to keep walking.
I love that. I think the concept of doing less and being less is something we do not hear very often. And I think that's such a beautiful way to look at it. I think I honestly am kind of speechless at
Thank
what a
you.
beautiful what a
Thank you.
beautiful perspective that is. And I think that's a beautiful thing about speaking to people. I'm in my 20s, but talking to people that are older that have experience that I don't have. And you're right. They all say like the little stuff you're worried about now actually isn't so big. You think it's big and it's not that big. But then I guess the question is, what do you think actually is that big in your 20s, in your younger years? What is worth caring more about?
Right. Oh, well, the real stuff. I do have an answer to that. Like the real stuff. I mean, just to use writing as a kind of example, since I am a writer, the advice I always give to people who are, in their 20s and saying, "How do I get published? How do I get published?" My advice is, stop focusing on getting published and start focusing and focus on being a good writer. You know, like focus on the real thing. Like how you get published is you write something that others say, we have to read this. And I do think that sometimes what we do is we leap over the important thing, which is the work, the internal work, the professional, apprenticeship, whatever that is, because we are all so trained in our society. We are to be like the external validation is the mark of success, right?
Yeah.
And so to focus on the real thing instead of the external validation, that is absolutely so key to a sense of well-being. And also like it eventually leads to greater success. Because like
Yeah.
if you're always, if your marker of success is outside of you, you're doomed really, ultimately. Because, someday you're not gonna get that external thing. So if you can answer that question within yourself, did you do the work? Did you give it your all? That's success. When Wild was published, let's see, I'm 54 now, and Wild was published 11 years ago. So I was 43 when Wild was published. And it's my second book. I'd been a serious writer since I was like 20. And so I was a writer. Like I'd been a successful writer before Wild was published. But because Wild, of course, became like so successful, I spent like a year or so being asked, "Oh my gosh, like what's it like now that you've had this big success? Hasn't your life changed so much?" And I always would very truthfully say, like, well, yeah, my life hasn't changed that much. I mean, like, because yeah, I can now afford to pay my bills for the first time. That was true. Financially, I had financial security for the first time. But my actual life, like my sense of who I was in the world did not shift for two reasons. One, I already considered myself a successful writer before Wild was published. I had answered those questions within myself. I had done the work. I had done this to the best of my abilities. I was really, doing what I was called to do, and I had been doing it for decades by the time Wild came out. And so it wasn't that like Wild comes out and it's a bestseller. And then finally I'm like, finally my dream is true. I'd already made my dream come true because I had shifted the lens. The lens of my, my achievement wasn't like outside myself. It was inside myself. So that was one thing. And the other thing was that like I had really had a sense of like really very clearly recognizing that, that kind of external validation does lead to, a depletion essentially of your self-esteem. Like, if you're always asking others for permission, if you're always asking others to tell you you're good enough or you're okay, if you're always asking others to reassure you, to say like, that they love or like you rather than you saying, I love, like, what do you feel for that person versus what they feel for you? Like if you put all of those validating factors outside of yourself, there again, you're doomed to have this sense of scarcity rather than abundance, of failure rather than success. So I don't know if that answers your question.
No,
kind of a
it
lot,
absolutely does.
but
No, that absolutely does. I was thinking about several things as you were talking. I was thinking about a quote that I love that says, if happiness is always somewhere else, it's never where you are. And that
yes,
really resonated with what you were saying about that external validation. And also just the fact that I think the things that matter then in your 20s are everything that take place inside of you, is kind of what I
Yeah.
gathered. Everything that takes place in your mind, in your heart, how you are transforming the way you look at the world and the way you look at yourself, and nothing to do with the people around you, the jobs you get, the promotions you do or don't get. Um, that the focus should be internal always, I
Yeah.
think.
And I think sometimes that gets mixed up in people's minds with a kind of narcissism. It's like, well, how do I feel about that? That's what's matter.
Yeah.
That's what matters. I'm not saying that at all. Because of course, what I'm saying here again, it's kind of like the put yourself in the way of beauty not being like a toxic positivity thing, but rather like a deep radical kind of real self-care where you say, even in the
Yeah.
hard times, it's up to me to find something bright. Um, when you do the thing I'm talking about, when you say like, actually, my measure of success is like, did I do this work rather than did I get the raise or the publication or the money or the fame or
Yeah.
whatever? Um, then when you can do that to yourself, you can also then apply it to other people. So that you're
Absolutely.
looking at somebody and you can say, there's my friend who's the documentary filmmaker. And yeah, they've never managed to like, finish a film, but wow, I so admire that work they're doing because I can see like my measure of their success isn't about some external thing either. That like, I don't think my friends who have like fame or the jobs that pay jillions of dollars or something are the ones who are the successful ones. Like your view of the world shifts too when you can view yourself with generosity and compassion and love, and I guess really a more nuanced kind of insight. You can view others in that way too. You look at the world differently.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way we treat people is always a reflection of how we feel about ourselves. And so I think the more that we cultivate our own well-being, it's the opposite of narcissism. It's actually us trying to put our best foot forward to the people around us. Our marriages, our families, our friends, everything around us will be affected by how good we feel about ourselves and how much confidence we have in ourselves and our abilities, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agree with that.
Well, I okay, real quick, I just want to ask, is there a worse piece of advice you've ever been given?
Well, yes, I have been getting some
Oh,
bad advice,
good. I knew
and
you'd have one.
it's from the same person who gave me the advice. I love the love many, trust few, and always paddle your own canoe. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, my mother's mom, when I was a teenager, and and I had a serious boyfriend, and I think she was getting like freaked out. She said to me, "Here's my advice for you," and she said, "And even when you're married, never, ever, ever let your husband see you naked. Like never take off all your clothes in front of your lover or husband." And I remember at 14, when she told me this at 14, and I was just like, so kind of like, disturbed by this and imagining like my just my grandmother all of her life having never, I mean, she was married to my grandfather for like, I don't know, 60 years or something. And never fully naked in front of him. And I have to say, as somebody who has given a lot of like sex and love advice, that is not advice that I would give.
I think that is pretty up there on bad advice. But I think if we go into a deeper meaning of that, I think given probably her generation, women weren't really as open as we're allowed to be right now. And I think it's a beautiful thing that now we are naked in so many ways. We can be naked in front of whoever we want, whenever we want, emotionally and in a vulnerability sense. And so I think that it was probably also a question of maybe a product of her generation that was just
Oh, for
women kind of
sure.
kept to themselves so much more.
Oh yeah. And then I mean it's actually to me really sad advice because it's
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying. I mean, she not only was of a different generation where really women were not allowed to be sexually liberated at all. And really we were supposed to be ashamed of our bodies. But she had another
Yeah.
layer of that because she was raised Catholic and was Catholic. And there's a lot of body shame where it's like, no, cover up, don't, and I think too, this feeling of like, her, she was also thinking that that was some way that she could have power by staying alluring was to be not vulnerable, to be not exposed. And, yeah, I think it speaks very much to the values that she was raised with and continue to live with. And I feel lucky that I, even at 14, could think, you know what? Bad advice.
Yeah. Yes. I think that was wonderful bad advice. Thank you.
Wonderful bad advice.
Yeah, wonderful bad advice. Is there one last quote of yours, maybe someone else's, that you think someone listening right now might need to hear and you want them
Oh
to listen to?
gosh. I'm always like trying to memorize the quotes because I'm like, okay, um, I carry them around in my mind, and then the minute I'm ever asked for them, like I'm like, what's a quote that I live by? I don't know.
You could take a
Um,
second too. If you need to
uh,
look it up, we can cut this
okay,
out and
I'm
you
gonna
can look
look.
it up.
I think I have
Yeah.
a little quotes thing.
Oh, perfect. I just
Yeah.
know people. And also if you need a scurry, I'm sorry, I'm over time. I'm 7 minutes over time.
Oh, yeah. No, don't worry. Okay, we're okay.
Okay, okay, good.
So let's see. There's a quote that I absolutely just turn to again and again. And it's not so much a quote, it's actually like it's kind of 2 or 3 lines. It's the entirety of a poem by Raymond Carver. My son's name is Carver, so he's named after this writer, Raymond Carver, who was an amazing short story writer, but he was also a poet. And it's a short enough poem that it really functions as a quote. And here's what it is. And did you get what you wanted from this life, even so? I did. And what did you want? To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved on the earth. And I think that came to mind for me really just on the heels of our discussion about like, those important things that really matter. When I was saying like, the advice I'd give my younger self is to like remember that the real achievement is feeling love and being beloved and and loving others. The real achievement is connection. The real achievement is doing the work you're called to do. The real achievement is listening to that truth, the truest inner voice within you, who knows who you are and knows what you want. And I feel like that poem is about that. It's a wonderful reminder. The poem is called Last Fragment by Raymond Carver. And I think that another cool thing, so much we've been talking about like, oh, if you look back at the beginning, what would you have done differently? And that poem is obviously a kind of almost like end of life thought. Did you get what you wanted from this life? To call yourself beloved on the earth, and to say, yes, I did. I think that's the greatest achievement of all.
Well, I think the mic can be dropped now. I think that um that is the most beautiful conclusion we could have to this conversation. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join us and for sharing your wisdom and all of the work that you've done. I know I've shared your quotes on my page, but honestly, sometimes I just like Google online best Cheryl Strayed quotes, and that will just be my inspiration for the day. And it makes my day better and it makes me feel seen and understood, which I also think is something a lot of people are looking for. So thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Christy. It's been a delight to talk to you.
This has been wonderful. And to all of our listeners, thank you so much for listening to The Shift.